Good morning. I'm Anthony Lilley, and my colleague Paul Moore will be speaking in a sort of little sequence this morning. You should know of me first that I'm originally and continue to be a media and creative industries entrepreneur. So I head a creative company called Magic Lantern and a media investment company, as well as having a role as a consultant and a theorist, and sometimes as a professor of creative industries. I was the original kind of lead author of this work, with a huge amount of support from Paul over a period. Paul is a real academic and an artist alongside that. Arunish has just done a rather good job of my opening. The quote from Einstein was one of our inspirations in this work. Everything that can be counted does not necessarily count, which is a question of how you prioritize the data, the inputs into our data and systems, and this very crucial second part of that everything that counts cannot necessarily be counted. The cultural, social capital impact of a large amount of cultural and artistic investment is notoriously difficult to measure, and one of the hypotheses of our work, one of the questions we were trying to ask was, is the rise of increasingly network society and digital society, is it changing any aspect of either how we count and measure the things that we know we need to measure, the data we know we need to use, and at the same time, are there new ways becoming available to us through the availability of larger amounts of data and big data techniques that we might measure some of those intrinsic benefits from cultural activity. And I think we came to the conclusion that big data, and I'll come back to what that means in a moment, won't necessarily of itself change the arts and culture, but that there is an explosion of what we call bigger data. So more and more data is already available to the arts and culture, which is definitely able to change the landscape that we're working in. And that big data, this larger concept, should change cultural investment and cultural policy making, but there are a number of reasons we need to address about why, a number of challenges that need to be addressed that will make that difficult to achieve, to do with the nature of the cultural sector, but also to do with the nature of skills and to do with the nature of the availability of the right talent. So we explored the major concepts of this piece of work through a variety of techniques. Yesterday, Pierluigi was talking about the notion of culture 1.0, 2.0 and 3.0. We have a similar, very simplified conception of what we call the data maturity spectrum, which you could break down into three steps likewise. That in the first stage of the arrival of technology into the cultural landscape, the digital technology into the cultural landscape recently, what really happened was that technology was predominantly used to make digital versions of existing ways of working, whether that was the ticketing systems of theatres or whether that was to automate lighting control on a stage. Really what happens, and this is usual in technology adoption, was that those first steps were the digitization of existing ways of working. And then in data 2.0, we see the arrival of new forms of data, such as web traffic data, which are becoming an important part of our mix. And more recently in data 3.0, this very fundamental shift caused by social networks, caused by the propensity, the use of people's mobile data devices, for instance, and this huge explosion of peer-to-peer activity, which changes, we would suggest, forever the landscape of the way that data is applicable in the culture. One of the questions we then started to address was what do we need to do to make the best and most efficient use of data as it currently is available to us? Because there is more and more around, but actually when we looked in the UK, which is where this work was limited, at the existing data systems of cultural organisations and artistic organisations, they were quite far from state-of-the-art industrial approaches that I'm used to in my commercial work with broadcasters and large international companies of FMCG, retail type companies, right through to publishers and newspapers. So what do we need to be efficient was one of our key questions. And then what is the potential of big data? And I'm going to come to a very loose definition of big data shortly. But actually, when we arrived at the analysis phase of the work, what fascinated us more than anything was the impact piece. How to ensure that all this data and all the available data that we could use actually led to change and actually led to increased impact of cultural work, improved efficiency and improved resilience, especially in the economic circumstances of cultural organisations. And what needs to happen to actually bring a culture of thinking about data and bringing data into the decision-making process, and how that can occur. Which then led us to some practical next steps, which I'll talk about at the end of our presentation, many of which are already being actioned in the UK, around what could be done to start to accelerate the beneficial use of data. But first, before I hand over to Paul, a quick overview of what we think is happening to data. This explosion, Data 3.0, the social media moment, is about a change from closed and relatively small and controlled systems, which you might think of broadcasting as an example of that, where there are a limited number of broadcasters with very close control over the technology, to a situation now where we have a much more open and much more complex landscape with many more players involved, including, I've often referred to ordinary people as the people formerly known as the audience, as active participants. And what this is meaning is that we have three vectors of big data: volume, variety, and velocity, by which I mean volume, the three V's, three-letter V's. That volume is the sheer enormous quantity of data that is available and that we're subjected to as individuals on a daily basis. Variety is that we have, again, an explosion of the kinds of data which are available and which we are able to deal with. And velocity is the notion that we are increasingly subject to enormous volumes and varieties of data all the time as live data, so that it isn't sufficient anymore to have a process under which once a day or a week or even a year we capture data and analyze it. We actually are able to, and we will get great benefit from acting on that data as it is coming into us at very high velocities. But we did all of this in the context of some assumptions about what's happening in the world and some theory, which I'm going to hand over to Paul to take you through for a few moments. Paul.
Good morning. I'm particularly privileged and delighted to be here this morning because I come to you from a place called Londonderry, or Derry, where the campus of the university is. And that city at the moment is the UK City of Culture. I know that Vilnius was the European City of Culture, and we will be the European City of Culture next year, when we've finished with the UK City of Culture. And in many ways, that's why I'm involved in this, because I found it interesting yesterday that we all made a kind of presumption that we knew what culture was and that we all had the same definition of culture. And in actual fact, I'm not entirely sure what culture is. I think it's a complex kind of concept. But I want to get involved because one of the things which Derry, Londonderry, my hometown, has shown is that culture can transform cities. Because Derry was a city coming out of conflict, a divided city, which in the few months of this year which has already gone, has completely transformed itself into a different place and is now seen as possibly the most liberal space in Northern Ireland. That is an incredible, forceful argument for taking this seriously. And one of the great world figures who came out of Derry was our now sadly gone poet laureate, Seamus Heaney. And Seamus Heaney, in his most famous poem, Digging, talked about his father digging potatoes and digging turf as a metaphor for culture and life. And he says in that poem, "Between my finger and my thumb, the squat pen rests, snug as a gun." Well, like Heaney, I wanted to dig with that pen. And that's one of the reasons why I'm involved in this project. Because for me, culture and creativity are not commodities. They are not simply commodities. Culture is everyday lived experience. And the problem for me is, how do we measure that? And I was delighted when Anthony asked me to be involved in this, because whether we like it or not, we are going to be measured. And we are going to be asked to produce the proof of our impact. And if that is the case, I would like to have some control and some say over how we measure that and what we measure. And therefore, I was delighted to get involved in this project. Because where we are now is an incredibly complex space. We have all kinds of different movements, ideas, technologies colliding in a very fluid space, which is changing more rapidly than any of us either like to think about or actually probably can cope with. My favourite example of that comes from Cathy Davidson, who is a professor at Duke University. And she has done some research to show that the students which I teach at this moment, 65% of the jobs they will go into have not yet been invented. That's a terrifying statistic. How do we deal with that? How do we measure that? How do we take this complex mix and do something with it? I was also interested yesterday about us continually saying in these really, really powerful presentations that we needed to think about digitization. In actual fact, digitization has happened. It's over. It has emerged. And what we need to be thinking about is what Anthony has called and what Pierre Luigi called yesterday, point 3. What are we going to do with this? Because if we look at this, we now can see very clearly that we live in a new landscape. That the areas in which our creativity and our culture take place have shifted dramatically. Now, for many of us, we are now so immersed in that, it is so pervasive, that we don't actually step back from it and analyse it and look at it and think about that. We don't think about the power that the smartphone has, which we carry in our pocket, which if you'd had it 20 years ago could have taken you with Neil Armstrong to the moon. We don't think about that kind of technological power because it is immersive. But that's what we need to measure. How do we find ways to measure that will allow us to say to policymakers, yes, put your money here? Because I'm an artist and I know what culture does, but how do I prove that to the policymakers? The way we do it at the moment is by trying to use statistical analysis. And these are just some statistics that were used in a governmental conference last year, which I was lucky enough to attend, called Get Creative. I love the way creative has been put in front of everything now to make it okay, as if just having the word will make everything fine, the world will be wonderful. The only place they haven't used it is in accounting. I'll allow you to think about that. The fact is that, yes, these are measurements, and these are the measurements we take at the moment, but they tell us very, very little about what people were actually thinking, what they were feeling, what their mood was, how it changed their day-to-day existence, how it altered how they thought about other people, other races, other genders. How do we measure those really crucial things and get to the bottom of them? We've got to think about the kind of impact that these creative sectors and digital sectors are likely to have. The way in which we can think about innovation and the modern economy image, and how we take that and say to policymakers, we have found a way in which we can show you how these crucial sectors make a difference. We can find a way that we can at least show you the scale of impact of these things by using the kind of data analysis, the 3Ds, which Anthony has already outlined. And the same is true if we think about tastes and standards and ethics. We can lay those alongside the other measurements so that we get a more comprehensive picture of the way in which we analyse and we think about what people are doing and feeling. Things like socialisation, political engagement. How does that impact on the way in which people think? And does culture and cultural activities and creative activities actually create a change whereby we get into political accountability, we get into human fulfillment, and we actually think about measuring those kinds of things? But continually, we keep coming back to the statistics because the money matters. The money is all that matters. And again, these are just some figures that are thrown. They're impressive figures. They're very impressive figures from the UK. But they don't tell me everything I want to know. Because if I put on an exhibition, or if someone puts on a piece of theatre, they don't just want to know that it took X euro at the box office. They want to know how people felt. They want to know when those people left, did they care more about their fellow citizens? Did they care more about other citizens? Did they care more about how they dealt with people on a daily basis? These are the really key things, in my opinion, as well as the economic. Of course the economic matters. It's easy for me in a public sphere, working and paid by the public purse, to say that the commercial piece doesn't matter. Of course it matters, but it is not all that matters. Not everything that can be counted counts in that sense. And of course, what this means is that we've had a huge value shift in the way in which we think about how we measure these things. So we've had this shift because I do believe that the digital has happened. It will continue. It's a growing piece, but it has emerged. So we've moved from physical, traditional, to digital content and trade. We've moved from media creative content providers to consumers and advertisers. We've had a shift in value from the middle to the head and the tail with content and product markets. We've had a shift in value from semi-skilled to skilled workers, and the impact that has on an institution like mine and how it thinks about the employability as well as the social welfare and education of its students. We've had a shift from local market leaders with access to scarce resources to complete local, regional, global brands with access to consumer loyalty at huge scale. Some of the presentations we saw yesterday spoke of that as well. And we've had this shift from a focus on domestic markets to regional and global markets. So how on earth do we measure the impact of all of that? Well, having looked at this and having researched it alongside Anthony, I'm absolutely convinced that big data is the glue which holds these trends together. It's the cement, if you like, which allows us to at least hold the complexity for long enough to be able to do some examination of it. But it does need an entirely new way of thinking about measurement, because big data offers three new possibilities for measurement. The first is that not only can we measure the granular, which is what most of statistics does actually. Statisticians love exactitude. They detest the messy. And it has to be said that big data is messy. which is why I thought I was quite amused by our chair's third slide. Because big data at the output stage is fairly messy. We have to get our hands dirty when we're thinking about how we deal with big data. But it also allows you to measure the macro. So you get away from notions of exactitude into notions of scale. And that's a crucial shift in how we think about how we measure things. The exact point, whatever, does not matter. We're thinking about the vastness and the breadth and the scale of the responses that we're getting, which gives us an entirely different set of answers. That means that we don't just measure. We have to actually curate the data coming in. Measuring is no longer enough. It's a process of curation as well as measuring. And so we have to learn some new skills around that, about how we use this data and how we put that data out there. And those new skills, if you like, are crucially about moving away from causality, that because this happened, this caused this, into thinking about patterns and correlations and links between various pieces of information. That really is the crucial, for me, theoretical piece about big data. That shift from pure measurement, how many to the decimal point, no longer matters within the big data space. What matters is showing how this particular product, this particular piece of artistic practice, had this number of impacts on this scale across a global audience. And we can begin to see patterns. Interestingly, that area, that region all thought that. That region thought that. And we can actually measure mood. We can do the sentiment analysis. We can find out how people actually felt about things by looking at what they're saying about it on Twitter and on Facebook and in those kind of spaces. And this is a quote from 2013 from Mayer, Schoenberger, and Kukier. Before big data, our analysis was usually limited to testing a small number of hypotheses that we defined well before we even collected the data. When we let the data speak, we can make connections that we had never thought existed. And that's what I mean about being surprised by the connections which come together when we look at the big data. I then was trying to think how we can simplify that, and how we can simplify that for the social capital that we're talking about, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about social and cultural capital. And I am no longer going to make any excuses or be defensive about the fact that social capital and cultural capital is every bit as important, if not more important, than economic capital. We have to stop apologizing for that, as though you people are doing the really important stuff, but here's a little bit about social capital and cultural capital. That is probably, in the space that we're moving into, the big data space, the key matrix of measurement: social capital and cultural capital. It really, really offends me in the UK when they talk about artistic practice of any form being a soft industry. Anybody who's worked in this industry knows there is nothing soft about it. It's a hard, hard place to exist. And culture is hard. It hurts. I love to subvert a phrase which is attributed to some of the German military leaders pre-war. Someone who's supposed to have said, "Every time I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun." Well, I'm afraid in Northern Ireland, every time I hear the word gun, I reach for my culture. And I argue it on social capital and cultural capital. So how do we put that into the cultural capital space? Well, this is a little trite in one way, but I think it's a simplified way of thinking about that social and cultural capital. We look at the hits that a particular thing is getting on Facebook, Twitter, Google, wherever it is, Google Glassboard, whatever people are using. We look and see what the hits are, what people are saying about it. We then look from the hits to the likes. And I'm using shorthand here. I don't mean just like in the Facebook sense. But what are people saying about it? What was it they liked? How did they like it? With what force did they like it? With what mood did they like it? And then we move from the likes to the links. Who then come in and said to them, interestingly, I thought that as well. And that person could be anywhere on that global platform. And then that allows you to measure the impact of what is going on. What I'd like to do now is to show you how that impact works by showing you a short video, a little piece of it. You'll be glad to hear I'm not going to show you it all. From a Massachusetts Institute of Technology academic called Deb Roy. And Deb Roy was interested in trying to measure how his young child learned to talk. And so for a complete year, he filled the house with video cameras in the ceilings and created the biggest family photograph album you have ever seen. It was millions of terabytes in size, and they measured everything that happened. So he could find out and measure where the child began to speak. But then some of his co-researchers realized this has got a wider implication. And we could start looking at Facebook and Twitter and what people are saying about things in that way. So this is Deb Roy coming in, if the technology works, at the moment where he is talking about what happened when President Obama made his presidential speech.
The content, very interesting structure becomes visible. We call this a co-viewing clique, a virtual living room, if you will. And there are fascinating dynamics at play. It's not one way. A piece of content, an event, causes someone to talk. They talk to other people. That drives tune-in behavior back into mass media. And you have these cycles that drive the overall behavior. Another example, very different, another actual person in our database, and we're finding at least hundreds, if not thousands of these. We've given this person a name. This is a pro-amateur, pro-am media critic
our television
who
stations,
has this
and top layer of
high
people.
fan-out rate. A lot of people are following this person, very influential, and they have a propensity to talk about what's on TV. So this person is a key link in connecting mass media and social media together. One last example from this data. Sometimes it's actually the piece of content that is special. So if we go and look at this piece of content, President Obama's State of the Union address from just a few weeks ago, and look at what we find in the same data set at the same scale, the engagement properties of this piece of content are truly remarkable. A nation exploding in conversation in real time in response to what's on the broadcast. And of course, through all of these lines are flowing unstructured language. We can X-ray and get a real-time pulse of a nation, real-time sense of the social reactions and the different circuits in the social graph being activated by content.
And if that doesn't inspire policymakers, then they don't have an aesthetic heart.
Thank you, Paul. So in the context of that theoretical sort of understanding, which Paul and I share, our report, which is entitled Counting What Counts, was looking at this landscape and trying to suggest practical activities for policymakers and for cultural organisations themselves. I should say here I'm policymaker and consultant in the UK some of the time. I'm also board member of our great opera company, the English National Opera, amongst other things. And so I'm very interested not only in the social capital measurement part, but also in how we can improve our case in funding, but also how we can improve our commercial piece. So our objectives were to look at the whole of the landscape because it's necessary to think about big data in this very wide-ranging way. The way we went about it was to look at the best practice in the commercial field, to try and understand this sort of rather slippery concept of what big data is. One thing I would recommend is do not try, if you're going to look at big data in policy terms, do not spend a long time trying to define it so that everybody agrees what it is, because it is impossible. Because big is a very slippery word, and so is data, and when you put them together, you have something that everybody will disagree on. What you should be able to agree on is the broad principles of change that are occurring and what they mean. Another piece that Paul and I expressed this differently, but Paul has effectively just said this in a different way, was that the way we think about the use of data, whether it is public funding that is being evidenced, or whether it is inside a cultural organisation trying to use data at its board level, for instance, to understand how to change its strategy or how to operate differently, we have an issue with the relationship between the way the data has been used and the word subsidy and the culture of subsidy. Because in a culture of subsidy, data is seen as a problem. It's seen as an imposition. It is seen as something that cultural organisations are forced to give. It isn't an asset. It's not seen as it is in a big data worldview and as it is in a commercial investment worldview. It isn't seen as something you utilise, you make use of because it's beneficial. It's seen as the sort of thing that the government asks you for, and a burden. And that is to do with a culture of subsidy and the way we think about subsidy. Now, in the UK and across parts of Europe, and we heard it yesterday, often the word investment is used in the cultural field. And my opinion as somebody who lives between the commercial and the cultural policy fields is that word is often used, but it usually means subsidy. It doesn't come with, for it to be truly investment and thought of as investment, it would need to come with an approach to measurement and an approach to impact, as Onush said at the beginning, which was more rigorous than our current models. So at the base of this is a need to shift away from a way of thinking about the money we put up here as subsidy and really genuinely operate as if it is investment. In that context, we then looked at very specific elements. I talked about the data maturity spectrum. It's a very simplified idea. But the crucial thing Paul already discussed is that we are now in a digital space. And we are now in a space where effectively the amount of data, the variety of data, and the speed at which it comes at us are uncontrollable. It is not stoppable. It's like a river. You never step in the same data twice, in the same way that you never step in the same river twice. If you dam rivers, you can get really beneficial usage out of them. If you go with the flow of them, you can get a different kind of usage out of them. We looked in detail at an analysis of social value creation. What does social capital mean? Who's looking at this in the context of big data and social networks? And actually the answer was quite disappointing in terms of academics, in terms of researchers. The lion's share of the work that is happening, the large share of the work that is happening in the very commercial field and the very technology-specific fields. The cultural field is behind the pace in terms of understanding how these new models of data can be connected to what is very deep thinking about the social value that artistic and cultural activity creates. But that connection is not yet really happening. And we looked at the maths of how networks function and how they connect together and who drives change in networks and how you influence them. There's a lot of theoretical work happening there, and a huge amount of that is happening in marketing and advertising industries. Because the ability to understand how networks function is of fundamental importance to today's commercial marketeers. And so there's a great deal of work there that can be built on. And we looked, as Paul hinted at, this notion of sentiment analysis. If we'd been able to show you the Deb Roy video, and I'm sure we'll be able to find a way of linking it to you, one of the fascinating things that is happening in research and academia is a large number of people working on how to understand the mood and the feelings of that are evidenced by people's Facebook or social media activity or even their email. And we are now living in an age where it has become apparent that everybody's email is being read. Well, it already was. Usually by marketeers or Google or somebody else in any case, and they were reading it looking for the outlines of behaviour so that they could sell us an advert or they could in some way make money from us. And we were surprised as we talked to cultural leaders in the field in the UK and elsewhere how few people understood the mechanics, how the economics of social networks function, which for me is best summed up in the phrase that if you're not paying for the product on a social network, you are the product. Your data is being sold, so you are the product. What recommendations did we come to? Because I'm aware of time. This was an action project as well. We ran some experiments, some of which were more successful than others, and we tried to look at what organisations and policymakers should do, because this is live. This isn't a thing we have a year or two to think about, while we get round to making a policy. We can benefit from this right now. So clearly the first thing you need to do is understand where you're at, to audit both policy and strategy, and also technology, and to some degree the business models of what you're looking at. Now, this isn't some grand IT project. This is strategy. This is really understanding the approach that you're taking to the question and the possibilities of data. Then, and we've begun this in a new project, to start to build understanding of the possibilities of data. When you describe to somebody for the first time, as I've done many times now, a project that Google run, we have Google Art project in the room, don't we, I think? But a project that Google run around a thing called flu trends, which is quite old now, for influenza. In parts of the world, they started in the US, and Google started noticing that there were spikes in search terms related to the symptoms of influenza. And they can see that in Google because of the analytics and the detail that they have. And instead of simply saying that's very interesting, somebody had the idea that perhaps they could therefore predict where people were going to start showing up at the doctors with with influenza, maybe a day or two later. And it turns out that they can. And it turns out that therefore they can suggest to certain regions that maybe they want to bring in new vaccines or additional stocks of vaccine. And that's a very simple, quite old example of the difference between sampling and seeing the pattern and understanding. So that kind of building understanding, bringing people in who are working with data to understand how it has real-life impact. And from there to develop strategy. Senior decision makers in most policy and contexts that I've worked in find this very difficult, this territory, this area of work, because it isn't. It's challenging a number of ways of working that have been around for some time. But once people understand it and they have that moment, it's very quick for them to realize that there's a huge benefit for them here. Then there's a job for funders, policymakers, and strategists, which is to change the landscape for all the organizations below. Now, the way we're doing that in the UK at the moment is experimenting with how our arts and cultural funders, some of them, might change their key performance indicators, their KPIs, so that we start to ask for more meaningful data more regularly and interpret it in a more high-speed fashion at the policy and funding level. If those organizations have a good strategy and change their approach to data so that it is about measuring the impact, not just about accountability, that will trickle down, that will flow down through the system in a really strong way. Now, there are difficulties and challenges which we don't have time for today. That's a whole conference about how to do that. But there is a very catalytic effect, as we know, from changing behavior that can be where behavior change can be caused in that way. And then there are prototypes. Paul and I are just about, we hope, to begin on a project which will bring 3 major cultural organizations, a national data organization together, and where one of the things we'll be doing will be putting data scientists into residence inside 3 of our major cultural performing arts organizations in the UK, living inside the organization and attempting to understand the data flows and how to tell stories to the senior management about what big data can do. So we're very interested in the applied benefits of this. And then we need to build the technical capacity, and this is one of the things we're trying to do with the data scientists idea, how to get the capacity into the system, the overall cultural system, to take advantage of these opportunities. And that's all about data-led decision-making. Paul mentioned it earlier. Because I don't believe that data is a panacea. It will not solve our problems. It's another tool in the armory, a very powerful one, big data in particular. But if you'd like a reading list, the American statistician Nate Silver's book, The Signal and the Noise, is an extremely good exposition of the potential of big data, but also the limits, how there are just some complex questions which are too complex, and how almost always human judgment and human interpretation of data is still a very key part. So this is not some sort of technological vision of taking away the need for an artistic director or a director of strategy. This is an element of the toolkit that people can bring. But there are problems with that, to come to a conclusion. I'm quite interested in how human beings make decisions. As a creator of interactive media products, which is my day job, games and websites and apps and things, knowing how people make decisions is a fundamental part of my skill set. And we're not evolved to deal with data. That's just a fact. We're involved to deal with certain types of data at certain scales, but not data at very large scales as yet. Now, that's not me, that's empirical evidence. That's Daniel Kahneman, the decision theorist, Nobel Prize winner, saying that there are genuine cognitive reasons why we have to think very hard about how we engage with data. It is not a natural evolved space for us. And senior decision makers may not be ready to adopt the data-led decision making. I'm quite fond of one acronym, the acronym HIPPO, H-I-P-P-O, as in the short word for hippopotamus. And HIPPO stands for highest paid person's opinion, which is usually what's used to run most organizations in my experience. And so if you have an organization run under the principle of HIPPO, data is, unless it proves what the HIPPO believes, in which case it's absolutely wonderful data, as we all know, because I suspect, including me, that there are some hippos in the room. But if it doesn't prove us, then clearly there's something wrong with the data. That isn't true of big data. It's true of the interpretation. And so we need to think about how to get senior decision makers to be ready for this way of thinking. And we need to understand the limits of data. There is a common trend that technology talks to present everything as a solution. And in fact, this is just another toolkit, as I previously said. So our conclusion has been that, and is, that the current approach in culture is out of date and inadequate. Now, this is not culture, this is in very many fields. But that's an opportunity, that's not a threat, that's not a criticism, because it's possible to move very quickly. But that already opportunities are being missed here. I am quite surprised by the amount of conference speeches and meetings I go to where and it's delightful that everybody looks, when I talk about something like Google flu trends, and everybody looks very excited and amazed by that. But that is 3 or 4 years ago. That's some time ago now. The acceleration of the the data 3 and culture 3 sort of landscape is happening, and it's happening more and more quickly. And so that's an even greater challenge with every passing day, but we just have to get used to that. The other conclusion we came to, because Paul and I work Paul in higher education, is that this isn't culture in a very only culture in a very arts definition. It's applicable to education policy and the wider cultural field. And that we need to build the foundations quite soon now. One of my board jobs is I'm a board member of the organisation that disperses research funding for the arts and humanities in the UK, the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And there we're trying to bring funding to bear, millions of pounds for higher education institutions to try and build the capacity that we need. But that alongside that, the policy framework needs to adapt, and quite quickly, to take advantage of these possibilities. And along the way, lots of organisations are prototyping, and that should be encouraged. Lots of organisations are trialling, they're experimenting, and that we can bring the learnings from those prototypes up into the policy landscape to inform it and help to improve the quality of it. But there are things we need to just bear in mind at all times. As I've said, this big data is not, and data-led approaches are not a panacea to the cultural sector's challenges, but they provide, as Paul was describing, extremely powerful tools to prove cases that previously we've relied on small amounts of evidence, excellent storytelling, politics. I don't want those to go away, but I do want them to be reinforced as much as possible in the same way that Paul does. And that this is the time. This is the time now to move on and to actually engage in detail with the potential of larger amounts of data and this wider big data field. The report's available online. It is the executive summary is designed for policymakers and people running cultural organisations. There's more depth inside it, and as those of you who write these reports know, there's about 3 times as much material that we didn't publish elsewhere. But I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope it's been interesting for you to listen to Paul and I. And there are our contacts. Are you going to try Deb Roy again? Is that what you're doing? So thank you very much.